All right, welcome everybody to the Fireside Chat for Jauhari series number 5. Let us welcome our guest for tonight, Judicial Commissioner, Mr. Mohammad Faizal Muhammad Abdul Qadir, everyone. Mr. Faizal is currently serving as a Judicial Commissioner of the Supreme Court of Singapore. Let us also welcome Ms. Henny So, Member of Parliament for Marsiling UT Group Representation Constituency and Director of MSc Law Corporation. Let us also give a warm welcome to Mr. Nazri Mokhtar, editor of Berita Harian. All right. Thank you, Mr. Faizal, for joining us here tonight. It is such a privilege. I am really excited to talk about tonight's topic titled A Journey in the Law, Building Resilience, Overcoming Adversity, and Looking Out for One Another. I mean, you have been a legal practitioner for nearly 19 years now, so I'm sure that failure is inevitable, whether that be failure of the emotional weight of losing cases, managing public perception, and just the sheer demands of the profession. But before we start, can you briefly explain to me what a Judicial Commissioner of the Supreme Court means? And please use simple words, especially for me.
Okay, welcome, hello everyone, and it's nice to meet all of you. I understand that the term Judicial Commissioner seems like a term of art. It's not intuitive, but effectively a Judicial Commissioner does everything that a Supreme Court judge does. So we have the exact same responsibilities, we have the exact same day-to-day life. The only distinction between a Judicial Commissioner and a High Court judge conventionally is that a Judicial Commissioner is appointed for a fixed term. So I'm appointed for a term of 2 years, and High Court judges have life tenure, so they're there till 65.
Oh, okay. So I'll have to remember that, okay, in case somebody asks me. All right. So I think we can start the Fireside Chat proper. Okay, so this is our 5th Jauhari series, and I think that it's always very helpful to start from the beginning. You have reached impressive heights in your career, but I think many of us would be surprised to learn that you actually come from humble beginnings. You came from a 3-room flat in Bedok North, your mother was a housewife, and your father was a taxi driver. You also mentioned that you faced financial constraints and lived on modest means. And you, just like many of us here, came from a neighborhood school, Bedok View, and you mentioned something rather shocking. You were actually not really good in school. In fact, you were very playful. So, I think it begs the question, which is, what is the difference between somebody who came from a similar background as that and you, who is now a Judicial Commissioner? You know, you are the first Malay Muslim to become senior counsel. What is the difference? Is it luck? Is it hard work? Or is it determination? What is it?
Thanks for the question. I think it's an interesting question, Kai. My own sense really is that it's a function of multiple considerations. Hard work obviously is a given for any profession. So I think we put that one side. But I think if I could distill it into a few factors, I would distill it into 3 different factors. The first, as you mentioned, Kai, is luck. The second, I would say, is support from the community and support from my family. And the third is the privilege of being in a profession that I love. And I'll explain each of these. So in terms of luck, I think we often downplay the significance of luck and happenstance in the work that we do, in the journeys that we take. In a different world, I wouldn't have been a lawyer. And the reason I say that is I graduated from Tampines Junior College in 1998. I thought that law was something I wanted to explore. Zealous young individual applies for law school, gets rejected completely because results were not good. So 1999, I didn't have a place in law school. I got a place in another faculty. But it was by luck that in 2000 and 2001, the government did a review of the law schools, and it decided it wanted to ramp up supply of lawyers. So instantaneously, because of national service, I had to wait 2 years. The opportunity to apply again came up. And suddenly you were applying in a situation where there were a lot more spaces. So notwithstanding the fact that my results weren't great, I was given the opportunity to come into law school. I don't know the impact of that specifically, but you can see how luck clearly played a part in all of that. So that's factor 1. Factor 2 is support from the community. Kai, as you mentioned, I came from circumstances where finances were always a bit tight. And during national service, I saved up my NS allowance. But even then, law school isn't necessarily a cheap endeavor. So during the course of law school, I was very fortunate to have received certain merit-based scholarships and awards. But even that sort of didn't necessarily cover the gap. I did some part-time jobs. And I remember in third year law school, for example, finances were a bit tight. And just again by luck, the dean's office called me. And they said that they presented my profile to a law firm. And it was a law firm looking to sponsor students that they thought had potential to sort of support them in their journey. And so for absolutely no rhyme or reason, this law firm decided to sponsor some of my education. And in a certain sense to sort of say, I have your back, I want to see you succeed, and I want to walk with you in that journey. So to a large extent then, I think that underscores the fact that community support is so significant in my journey. And that sort of informs my own decision to pay it forward. Because when you have the privilege of getting a good education in that manner, you do bear sort of a debt or a burden to give back to the community. And I've done that, and I'll love to share more on that later on if you wish to. And the third point I highlighted is really on some level, people sometimes ask the question, wow, you must be so smart, you must be so hardworking. And the reality of it is I'm lazy. I'm not necessarily the smartest person in the room, but I just happen to be in a profession that I love. And whether you like it or not, in any profession, from time to time, the hours will be bad. The hours will be long. The difficulties that you face will be significant. And it's much easier to do that when you see so much value in the work that you do, and when you enjoy doing the work that you do. Doesn't change the fact that there are going to be bad days. That's a given in any work. But the kind of meaningful work that I get to do on a daily basis inspires me. And in a certain sense, in that sense, I'm very fortunate to be in a field that I love.
All right, I actually want to delve further into the academic journey that you briefly touched on just now. So in case the audience does not know, you did just okay for your O-levels, right? Which led you to go into Tampines JC. Afterwards, you also mentioned that you actually could not get into law school, okay, in university as well, because your A-level results were, and I quote, not good enough. Right? But then you went on to eventually studying law at NUS, and then you did your master's at Harvard Law. So I just wanted to ask, as a judicial commissioner looking back, and with our young audience here tonight who may feel like certain setbacks, they feel like, oh, it's such a big hump and it taints their entire journey. Did it matter to you that you ended up in a not so, prestigious academic journey?
I think the answer to that is yes, it matters, but not in the way that the question sort of assumes. People often think that going to a less prestigious school is a bad thing. And I beg to differ. If you were to put me back in secondary school and you were to force me to go to all the top schools, my own suspicion is I wouldn't be here today. For a simple reason, those schools were not right for me. And we should stop looking, in my mind, at league tables to think I need to be at the number 1 school or number 2 school or whatever it is, and to ask ourselves the honest question, which school is the right fit for me? And in my journey, I think I was very blessed to go to schools that really cared about me, then developed me in a way that I needed to be developed, that allowed me to explore certain activities I had outside, for example, that I enjoyed, and that in that sense, got me ready when I was academically ready to make that jump, to be ready for it. So in a certain sense, I think going to the right school matters, but not in the sense of going to the top school, but going to a school that speaks to your strengths and that for which you are a good fit, academically speaking, and given all of your background.
Wow, that gave me a lot of hope. All right. Okay, I think we can move on to our next question. After graduating from NUS and starting your career, you were a justice's law clerk and assistant registrar, and you were immediately exposed to the demands of the legal world. And then you went on to have a long-standing career that now spans 19 years, and I'm just going to mention a few of the different positions that you've held, including Deputy Public Prosecutor in the AGC, Attorney General's Chambers, General Counsel and Director in the Singapore Medical Council, and Second Chief Prosecutor of the Crime Division at the AGC. So, going back to tonight's topic on overcoming adversity, is it true that the higher you go, the more problems you have? And if so, what do we as young people need to know in terms of the qualities that we should develop right now?
I could go on the entire night about that. But perhaps let me distill that into a few points, if I may. The first is resilience. And what do I mean by that? It's going to be tough when you start out in any profession. And I can only speak to the legal profession, but I assume it applies across the board. When I first started out as a lawyer, you always second guess yourself. And I remember the first trial that I did, for example, for cross-examination, I prepared 19 pages worth of questions. And of course, very proud of myself, right? Midnight, 19 pages of questions. I thought I had everything down pat. Went into court. By the third question, by about 5 minutes in, I realized the entire script I had prepared was completely useless. The case had gone in a completely different direction, and I suddenly had to freestyle the entire way. And at the end of that day, I went back to the office and I go, oh my God, I'm so not suited for this, right? And you start doubting yourself. And it's easy when you start doubting yourself to then think, I'm not suited for this. This doesn't fit me. I'm a lousy lawyer. I'm go and do some other thing because I might be better than that than in law. And a mentor sat me down and told me that everybody goes through this hump. Your first few years ultimately will be really difficult. And if it's not difficult on some level, you're not challenging yourself enough. So take comfort. And earlier I was having some discussion with some of the participants and they were saying it's so tough, them being in a law firm. And I tell them that that's actually a good thing. Because if you feel it's tough, you feel that you are getting knowledge and you are learning. If you come in on the first day and you feel you are coasting, you probably are not developing. It means the law firm is really not adding value to you. So on some level, the very fact that you are finding it tough in the first few years is a given. But it's also important to understand that that is a phase. The hours are going to be long. The learning curve will be very steep. But if you get past that, you can really do a good job. Then to the point about moving up the value chain, I do think that as you move up, your responsibilities become more significant. But it's also important to realize that that doesn't make you a super expert in everything. So in the context, for example, of being second chief prosecutor, the worst thing that you can do is to think you know better than your 200 prosecutors about everything that goes on. You do not employ good people to pretend you know better than them. They are all masters in their own field. They all know the facts better than you. They all know the law in relation to that specific point better than you do. It's not like fiction where if you go to the senior lawyer, you say, what is the law on X? And in a TV show, the lawyer will immediately tell you the answer. That's not how it works. As you move up the value chain, on some level, you have to delegate and you have to trust the people that you're working with to do a good job. And you have to empower them to make the decisions. And you have to, on some level, let go. And if you don't let go, then you just take on too much of a burden for yourself. And the third point I think I would highlight is even as you take on more responsibilities, it's important to have something that on the side, outside of work that you enjoy. It might be time with family, it might be holidays, it might be volunteer work. All of that is good. But you have to find something you are passionate about outside work. And it cannot just be work, work, work. You sort of need to find the right balance, even if the nature of the law is that it is a jealous mistress and you do need to spend a lot of time with it.
I mean, on top of resilience, is there something else that you can share, on top of that kind of skill? Maybe we want to have the skill of, how do we get back up quickly? Or how do we move on from a particular failure? Like, what kind of other qualities do we need to have?
So I think we need to be very alive to the fact that failure is a constant in any journey. I spoke earlier about not getting into law school the first time around, but the beauty of it, you will recall, Kai earlier introduced me very, very kindly. Kai never mentioned Faizal failed in the first time he tried to enter law school. Why didn't she highlight that? Because it's innate in our nature and we understand it that failure is a given in our journeys. And the faster we internalize that, the better. If you want to be the best professional you can be 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you need to clock those failures. The best way I've seen this articulated is actually by Roger Federer. I don't know whether you've seen the speech he gave this year in a commencement. It was really powerful, and he made this point. Roger Federer, as you all I'm sure know, is a superstar tennis player, right? One of the top 4 or 5 tennis players in the world of all time. His win record is something along the line of 80-85%. So very impressive. He then tells that particular commencement class what his actual win rate per point is. So if you break down all of his games by points, what is his win rate? Can anyone in this audience guess what it is? Just state a number. What percentage win rate does Roger Federer, one of the world's leading players, has for points? Sorry? 75%. Fair guess? Anyone else? Just random numbers. 62%. His actual win rate is 55%. And the point he makes is he fails almost as many times as he wins on a per point basis. And he says out of that you can derive 2 things. Firstly, if you cannot deal with failure, you will never win the game. Because the moment you lose the first point, you will self-destruct and then game over. So he says what he's learned very early on is fail, understand why you fail, move to the next point, don't dwell on it. And he also says that in the long term, if you keep doing that, your win rate per point only needs to be slightly more than 50%. You will end up as Roger Federer. You will be one of the best tennis players who has only won 55% of your points. And the point he's making, which I think is a really powerful one, is failure is a given. Deal with it, learn from it, and move on. So putting that in my context, in my previous life as a prosecutor, I dealt with litigation. And by definition, in a court setting, in litigation, there must, in most cases at least, be a winner and be a loser. Statistically, therefore, you win almost as many times as you fail. Of course, different people have different, in that sense, percentages, but more or less, you lose a lot. And you start getting used to that. You always have to learn from it because there's always a learning point to be had. But you can never dwell on it or think I'm a failure because I didn't do well. Because then you can never learn and you can never move on and be even more productive and more useful for both the organization and for Singapore.
All right, so in our journey to success, not only must we develop resilience, but we must also expect failure and we must be very good at getting back up. All right. Mr. Faizal, you said in an interview that you encourage more young people to pursue a law degree and believe that if there are more Malay Muslim lawyers, more people in the community can be extended assistance when and where it is needed. I know that there are a few law students here as well, so I would like to take this moment to ask you about, certain policies that have an impact on our community. As Judicial Commissioner, where do the courts come in shaping these policies, as well as why are certain sentences prescribed?
Wow, it's a very significant question. Again, I could go on all night with this, but perhaps I'll make 3 points. The first is, and I'm aware of the fact earlier when I surveyed the audience that most of you are law students, or at least aspiring law students, so you more or less have a background of what the law is. The first point I will make is the court's role in shaping policy. A lot of people think that the court is there to develop policy and to tell Singapore what policy is. That's not actually the role of the courts. The courts are there to deal with legal issues. Policy questions, socio-economic questions, what is good for Singapore in the long term is very much part and parcel of a societal matter which society as a whole has to discuss, have to come to a landing to, and effectively the government of the day has to present what it feels is right for Singapore to the public for the public to buy in. The courts are not the place, most times at least, to litigate these matters. So all of you presumably would follow the Section 377A litigation as an example, and you would appreciate that in that case, Chief Justice Sundaresh Menon highlighted that the court was not making a pronouncement on whether 377A is good or bad, because that's not its role in society. Questions of morality, questions of policy are best done by the public, by the government of the day, as a discussion of where society as a whole should go. And there's a way I can easily put that in terms of understanding how that works. Again, from that quick survey I did earlier, most of you, I gather, are either in school or just ended school. So educational subsidies will be very high on your list of things that you like or don't like, right? And if, let's say, a government of the day decides tomorrow that we are going to take away all educational subsidies and we are going to dedicate all of that to healthcare, right? All of you will have strong views on that, understandably. Some of you may like it, some of you may hate it, some of you may say, actually, there's a middle ground and neither of these answers are good, right? And that's for a discussion by entire society, moderated by the government, in order to come to a landing of what the sweet spot is. If you were to go to court, what you effectively have is one party saying it's good, one party saying it's bad, and the answer must, by definition, be binary. And it's an answer given by a judge who hasn't done a feedback session like this one to even understand what everybody's views are. So the courts really shouldn't be shaping policy, I think. So that's one thing that I think people don't necessarily understand about the role of the courts. Then to your question about sentencing, I sometimes call this the Goldilocks problem. Any sentence that is imposed, you will have one camp that says the sentence is too low, you have another camp that says the sentence is too high, and you have a third camp that says the sentence is just right. Right? You always have three camps. And statistically, what that means is, in any case where a sentence is given, 2/3 of the community will say the judge is wrong. And it's the nature of these things. It's understandable why people have strong feelings. But the moment you realize that sentencing is actually quite a difficult process. The courts engage in a principled decision-making process in terms of considering certain factors. Understandably, people in society might have slightly different views on it. It's good to have that conversation, but it's also important to appreciate the fact that there is no one right answer in most cases, and people will just have to accept on some level that the courts does it on a good faith basis with certain principles in mind. So the outcomes are consistent, they are principled, but they may not necessarily adhere to what everyone believes is the right answer. And the last point I think I'd like to highlight as well is sometimes the lack of understanding on access to justice. There's often this perception that, I can only get access to justice if I've got lawyers. And if I get good lawyers, it means I win. If I get bad lawyers or I don't have lawyers, I lose. And the courts have done a lot of work in trying to level the playing field. There are a lot of people that we see on a day-to-day level who either decide not to have lawyers on their own volition or just cannot afford to have legal representation. We've modified our processes to make that slightly easier for them. We are also conscious of the fact that they need to have an information repository. So the courts does a good job at making sure the information is accessible online. And they have help centers in the courts to help people navigate that. I think those are some of the common misperceptions that people have. But I'm happy to hear from all of you later in the Q&A if you have any other thoughts.
All right, thank you for explaining that. I just had to ask, because it's not every day that I get to speak to a judicial commissioner. All right, so I think this is my last question. So tonight's topic is actually a brainchild of yours because you are very passionate about the magic that emerges from hardship and the priceless courage of those who came from difficult backgrounds. And I'm sure many in the audience here tonight must have had the thought, what if I was given a different set of cards? Maybe if I came from a different family background, had gone to a different school, did not experience X, Y, and Z, then maybe I could have achieved more, do more, or be more. So, as a closing remark to the Fireside Chat, what is something you would like to impart to the audience here tonight who may come from a path that's not linear?
I like the last bit of what you said about a non-linear path. On some level, because I see that as a strength, not a weakness. And perhaps I can explain that. When you take a non-linear path, you often find yourself with a lot more richer experiences, and you develop better for it. Often, the outcomes as a result of pathways that we did not intend to take end up being deeply meaningful. And I'll use myself as an example of that. If you were to ask the Faizal in fourth year law school, what he was going to be growing up, meaning 20 years from then, his answer would be, and he's 100% certain of that, by the way, at that point of time, a commercial litigator in one of the big firms out there. And that Faizal would have been 100% certain of that being the case. As you can tell from Kai's introduction earlier, I did absolutely nothing in relation to that, right? I spent my entire time in the public service, in large part in prosecution service. How did I ended up there? I'm very much an accidental public servant. After I graduated, thinking the pathway for me would be to be a commercial litigator, a phone call came in about the possibility to clerk in the Supreme Court. I took that opportunity up, thinking that, after 1-2 years of doing that, I'll go back to the private sector. After that, I had the opportunity to go to the AGC, and I decided to do that. And I enjoyed my time. I enjoyed the people there. I enjoyed the meaningful work. So I stayed on for 17 years thereafter. If you were to ask me today, was that journey really the journey I should have gone? The answer would be absolutely. Is that the journey I intended to take? Not at all. In fact, if you were to ask that Faizal, who just graduated from law school, will you do criminal law? His answer will be clearly no. When I did my bar exam, my worst subject was criminal law. So it didn't seem like any indicator suggested that criminal law was for me. And yet, it ended up being the most meaningful experience one could have. And the point I make in relation to that is, don't knock unexpected journeys. Unexpected journeys can be very powerful. They can be very meaningful for you. The fact that you go on a non-linear path, I find, is actually a good thing. Because it means when you end that non-linear path, you have unconventional experiences that no one else has. It's very easy, taking law as an example, to take somebody with the exact same grades, with the exact same background, with the exact same journey. But you add someone like Henny So to the mix, and I'll put her on the spot here. You add someone like her to the mix, who, and she has stated this on record before, came from normal academic background, went to the Polytechnic, went overseas university, came back, did a wonderful job, and is now a member of parliament. You put someone like that into the mix, the kind of experiences and perspectives that she can bring to any law firm, to any organization, that a person taking a linear path could, she can do 1,000,000 times better in terms of giving experiences and perspectives that no one has. But what is important in that entire message? What is important is that even if you take a non-linear path, even if your journey is longer, even if the journey is more arduous, even if you need to walk slower, that's fine. But continue walking. Never ever stop. You fail when you stop, but you don't fail if your journey is longer.
I mean, it is also easier said than done to, just continue, don't give up, don't give up. But what if we do stumble and we do, for a moment, feel like all hope is lost? What do we do then?
I think at the end of the day, we must always contextualize what we perceive to be our failures. In almost every given setting, there is no situation which cannot be salvaged. There may be a small sliver of cases where that's not the case, but the large majority, you will always have an opportunity to stand back up. And again, to use the example of law school admission, and I think a lot of failures in life are like that. Often you only need to succeed once. So I could have applied for law school 10 times. The moment I succeed once, I'm in. And I'm irrevocably in. They can't kick me out after that, right? Unless I fail, obviously. So in a certain sense, in much of life, you want to get that nice, cushy job. You want to have that job that speaks to you. Even if you fail the first time, you fail the second time, you fail the third time, there's always a fourth, there's always a fifth, there's always a sixth. And in doing that, understand that sometimes it might be difficult, but the journey is valuable if you feel passionate about it. And in doing that, I also want to make a pitch for looking out for other people who are going through difficult journeys. You often don't know what your fellow Singaporean, your neighbor, your friends are going through. And it's important to look out for them to see where you can help them. I make this point in an article I wrote about a decade ago or thereabouts. If PH wants to circulate that, that's fine. In which I talk about a student that I met in a secondary school where I was the chairperson of the school advisory board. And as part of that process, the person was getting I think it's called an EduSafe Character Award. And I was part of the endorsement panel just to make sure that they are good fit, there are no red flags and so on. So each person would come in and you would speak to them for 5-10 minutes and then they would leave, and the principal who was seated beside me will give me a quick download of the person's background, their experiences and so on and so forth. So most of the interviews went entirely unexceptionally. But there was this one boy who came in. He just spoke about his schooling, what he was doing in school, so on and so forth. Perfectly conventional conversation. Then he left. And so I turned to the principal and said, okay, so we can give him the award, no problem. Then the principal then gave me the information download that he does with each student. Most of the information download was unexceptional, but his was this. This boy's father recently passed away from cancer. This boy's brother recently passed away from cancer. And the reason we know this is because the boy's brother's principal, when he passed, realized that, hang on a minute, some other members of the family might require support, guidance, counseling. And so that principal contacted this principal to tell him, hey, I've got a student who just passed away from cancer and his brother is in your school, so can you look out for him, right? That was when they found out that they all had genetic cancer. This boy knew about it. He had recently seen the demise of his father. He had recently seen the demise of his brother. And he was before me because he was second in standard in school. And I turned to the principal, I say, there's a certain irony to me sitting here and thinking I have any standing to judge him. Because if I were in his shoes, I wouldn't even be able to go to school. And this is a boy who's so resilient, who's so brave, that in an interview with me about his background, he can be talking about how he wants to excel in school and not lamenting about the background circumstances which would have been crushing to any of us. So I told the principal, let's do something for this boy. I went back to the office, spoke to a few friends, a few colleagues. We put up some funds for him. And I told the principal, to the extent we can, we need to support resilient individuals like this, because just, number one, their story needs to be told. Number two, more importantly, if you have that much resilience, that much bravery, you deserve to succeed. And we have to, as a community, find a way to make sure you succeed. So we got together some funds. Unfortunately, this story has a very bad footnote to it. A few months later, he himself passed away from the very same cancer. So that was quite crushing to all of us. So we passed the money to the family. They used some of it to defray his funeral expenses and some of it for themselves. But when you see someone like that, you can't help but feel inspired. But you can't help but also reflect on the fact that there's so much that all of us can do for our fellow member of the community who is either facing hardship, who's facing adversity, that we can reach out to, that we can help, that we can assist. Not every case, to be honest, is going to be as dramatic as that, but every one of us knows of somebody around us who may need a helping hand, who may need a listening ear, who may need some temporary help. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, when we see strong individuals like that facing hardship, still nonetheless pushing forward and trying to make something of themselves, for us to see where we can bridge that gap.
Mr. Faizal, thank you so much for sharing with us your journey and also giving us valuable lessons on resilience, determination, and bravery. All right. That is all for the Fireside Chat. We are now going into the Q&A segment. So raise your hands to ask your burning questions, and my colleagues will pass the mic to you. So can we have the first question? Okay.
Testing. Okay. Ironic, I work in tech, but the tech did not work for me. Okay, so hi, should I stand up?
Sure.
Okay, can. Yeah, I orang pendek, so I need to stand up, yeah? Okay, so thank you for the sharing. My name is Ainol. I briefly introduced myself earlier. I'm a backend engineer at IBM. So not exactly law related, but I resonate with your journey as someone who didn't have the smoothest path to school. Or an easy studying experience. So I think my question is, how do you consistently, grow in your career and, your personal development without, how do you handle the burnout, I guess? Because for me, I work in tech, there is a lot of changes. And at the end of the workday, I just want to switch off. But at the same time, I also know a lot of people who have their own side businesses. They do like social media. They are rushing here and there and everywhere. So I feel like I'm not growing fast enough, or I will tell. Sometimes I'll tell myself, oh, it's it had to redefine what I think about success and failure, right? But I think it still feels kind of paralyzing when you see a lot of things changing around you, but you wanted to be part of that change, but feeling burnt out with what you already take on. So I think, yeah, my question is really, how do you prioritize essentially and manage?
Thank you, I know. I think that's a very important question. I can only speak to my experience. My own sense is that we have to move away from comparing with someone else or with other people's journeys. Each of our journeys are unique. And the reality of comparison is that we never compare with people in much worse positions than we are or doing even less than we are. What do? We normally take the gold standard and then we say, why am I not doing like as good as that superstar, right? Invariably, in most settings, there can only be one or two superstars. Meaning if 100 people are doing the comparison, 98 people are angry and one or two people are happy, but even between themselves, they're looking at each other and saying, he's better than me, she's better than me, and there'll just be a lot of unhappiness all around. I think we've got to walk our own individual journeys and not be too fast about what people are doing. But to your other point about burnout, I think it's a real issue. It's important, I think, sometimes to be able to recharge outside our given professions. And I can only speak to what I do, but what I like to do sometimes is just take long walks, for example, after a really long day at work. And in a certain sense, recharge, not think about work, but it'll be interesting. I don't know what your experience is when you do that. I find the best ideas I have for work come up when I'm not thinking about work on some level. So you have to find your passion, and it doesn't have to be walking. It can be something else that you enjoy that allows you to recharge. And if my experience is anything to go by, you're going to find that when you recharge, the best ideas come out, your best thinking is done, and you can, on some odd and ironic level, do a lot because you've effectively mapped out what you need to do as a result of recharging. But you have to find something that you're passionate about. So for me, it's walking. For me, it's sometimes traveling. For me, it's spending time with my 3 young kids who will boss me around. So all of those are passions of mine. All of those are really fun to do, except when the kids are misbehaving, then it's never fun. But all of those are really things that nourish me. In the same way, a lot of the things I do with the community nourish me as well. They're fun. And in my mind, a lot of the things that you do outside of work must not be engineered towards what can I get out of this, but do I love it or do I enjoy it to do it for its own sake? And in my mind, if you do that, the rewards will come. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so I think we must, when we are facing burnout, we ought to recharge. And while we're recharging, we shouldn't feel like we're missing out on doing more.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so can we have the next question, please?
Yes.
Yep, okay.
Hi, Justice Faizal. My name is Zihan. I'm a student from Temasek Poly, studying law and management. Okay, so my question, the context is because I think I was hearing about from the news and about some events about how like one of the ministers, Mr. Desmond Lee, he was and some other philanthropists, they were helping the less privileged people, like those who, especially those who live alone, like helping them like to clean up the house, like the items that they might there might be a lot of items in the house, help them to clean up, provide for the needs. Yeah. So my question is that what are some areas where government and non-government organizations can do more to help like these less privileged people or communities?
Okay. I'm finding it a bit of a challenge, and I almost feel like I have to ask Hani to answer that question. But I can answer it from my perspective first, if that helps. Um, in my mind at least, as somebody who's not in government, I tend not to ask the question of what government can do, even if it is a really important question, and to ask what I can do. Because really, when you think about it, no matter how competent the government, no matter how well-meaning the government, no matter how well-resourced the government, no government in the world, no matter how good, can be all things to all people. There will be blind spots, there will be areas which are underserved, and the nature of policy is that it's quite broad brush necessarily, and therefore there will be blind spots, which is not by design, but it just happens. And I think it's important for us to then think, how can we bridge that gap? So just drawing on my own example, after I graduated, I decided, or at least I thought, having gone through the neighborhood school journey, that one area that I could really contribute in is to provide students who are of high potential but lower income in certain schools the opportunity to have someone who do for them the exact thing I got when I was in law school. Meaning the example I gave earlier about a law firm coming up and supporting me. So I started a range of scholarships, awards in certain schools and certain institutions that sort of looked out for higher potential lower income students, gave them some monetary support, gave them some assistance, and effectively sent them the message that somebody wants you to succeed. We want to see you get to a point where you can make a success of yourself and you can be an example to others. And I did that not because I asked the question, is government doing enough here? But because I felt if there's something I can do in that area, why does it matter what government is doing? It matters more what my impact is, not necessarily what government can do, because government cannot do everything by definition. So that's how I'll see it. I don't know, Henny, if you've got anything else to add. And I feel sorry to put you in a spot, but...
Sure.
Yeah, perhaps I can share in my capacity as the Member of Parliament and Grassroots Advisor for the division where I serve in. So usually when it comes to helping out the vulnerables in a community, we work very closely with all relevant community partners. One of which pertaining to the government is, of course, the Social Service Office that is actually managed by the MSF. So the MSF sites, in a way, actually sets up satellite office like Social Service Office that reach out and supports the vulnerable groups in the community, where in general, perhaps if someone needs help, they can either go straight to the SSO or they can approach us or any of the individuals and say that, okay, I need help, so what should I do? The SSO side will actually help to understand what exactly are the problems that the applicant face and refer them to the other ministries to see how to provide a more comprehensive support. At my end, as a grassroots advisor, what I can do is also to rally the community to come together to support. Just like what Faizal said earlier, a lot of times, in fact, in Woodgrove, what we do is I often echo for the community, from the community support. Because you stay in that place, you are most familiar with what are the resources available and also what are the strongest needs that's required. So then we can reach out to the relevant stakeholders and approach them to see how they can come in to help. So one example is, for example, we get the church to come in and in a way adopt one or two of the blocks where there are a lot of seniors. Every year they will do some community outreach there, bring them care packs, and specifically targeting the items that actually, for example, the seniors who stay in the studio apartments, they require. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miss Henny. Wow. Okay, can we have the next question, please?
Hello, Mr. Faizal. So I have a question. This is regarding a bit of law. So I've been doing this with my friend. There's a bit of story. So I want to know what's the difference between a parliament debate and also like a court case. Like what's the difference between a debate in a parliament and also like debate for like, you know, like different like court. There's sometimes like debate sometimes parliament there's also like debate. So I want to know like what's the difference between a court case and a parliament debate. Yeah, thanks.
Sure, thank you. I think there are two different platforms. So parliamentary debates are debates that people like Member of Parliament Henny will be involved in which they debate what the law, for example, if you want to pass a law, you need to debate whether it's good, it's bad, what changes or what tweaks need to be made to it, what are the pitfalls, what are the plus side, and then you then decide whether it's worthwhile pursuing that. And if Parliament decides in its wisdom that this is a good law, then it passes it. Then after that, in a certain sense, if there's a debate about whether the law is legal or how the law should be interpreted, that goes to the courts. So that's where the discussion is had in court about how to understand the law, what the contours of the law are, whether in a certain sense the law is legal or how to interpret the law, who wins as a result of this law and so on. So it's two different parts of the journey, I suppose. Parliament makes the laws, debates the laws, and once it's passed, if there's a dispute about the law or if somebody is, for example, suing as a result of the law, then the court will decide, and that's where the debates about whether a person is guilty or whether a person is liable then comes into the picture. I hope that clarifies.
All right, can we have the next question? Over here.
Hi, Mr. Faizal. In line with the current events, this is a legal question. So, in line with the current events, I personally have seen, I'm sure everyone has read the news that there's been a rise in younger offenders, specifically with drug offences. Then recently we've had, I think he committed the offence when he was still a teen, about 16 or 17. It's a very explicit nature of the crime, sexually, in sibling content. And in that case, the courts actually deviated from the natural norm where usually when there's a youth involved, probation would be considered. But because that particular case, the offender was, has been, how do you put it, has a very big disregard for the law. So at the end of the day, he was still convicted with a jail sentence. Then quite recently, I think today, there was a younger youth who committed murder against his own father. And despite the fact that he was being brought down to a charge of murder to culpable homicide, which is quite reasonable to me, but at the end of the day, he was still given a 6-year sentence. So ultimately, my question is, so far, as of now, 2024, we've been implementing, specifically when it comes to sentencing youths, we've been implementing a lot of analytical frameworks, like the usual elements of the crime, the age of the offender. But what is it that, like, do we see any progress or any changes to come from the courts when it comes to sentencing a youth? Because from the fluctuations of, say, drug offences, the ages are getting lower. From the nature of violent offences, they are getting more progressive. So will we see like a more progressive and softer approach from the courts when it comes to sentencing youths, or a different analytic framework?
Thank you for the question. I think it's hard for me to generalize about what appropriate framework would be without specific facts. And certainly in relation to the incident in the news today, I won't comment because it's before my brother judge, and it won't be fair to make any comment in relation to that. But I would say this, the courts are sensitive to the fact that, let's say, if certain offences are more prevalent, then there are sentencing principles that take that into account. So, for example, in the early 2010s, there was the issue of unlicensed money lending. There was a lot of harassment cases, as an example. And the court's response, understandably, was to take a much more robust stance on sentencing during that period of time, because this was becoming a real scourge. So the courts does take that into account, but it's also important at the end of the day to not think that frameworks are the end all and be all, because you do not sentence a framework, you sentence a person. And in sentencing a person, you've got to think about two main things. Firstly, the crime in question. And secondly, the culpability and circumstances of the offense. And often these vary wildly. And I'm sorry to make a plug for this, but there's a Mothership video that I did some years back which explains those concepts and in which I highlight, for example, that you can't say, oh, a murder took place, therefore the sentence must be X. Because the question you've got to first ask, how was this person involved in the murder? Was this person just there? Or did the murder actually, did the person actually perpetrate the murder or help in the murder? And also, what was the person's role? What was the person's background? What was the person's criminal record, as an example? All of these come into the picture. So it's very hard to generalize. And I suppose the simple answer, and it's a bit of a cop-out, I must confess, is that it really depends on the facts. If the facts require the courts to go hard, they will go hard. And if the facts require a more compassionate approach, they will take a more compassionate approach. So it really depends. And I realize that's not a very satisfactory answer necessarily, but the nature of these cases is that difficult cases really are cases that have to be analyzed very carefully. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Faizal. Okay, it's not a long question, but it's pertaining to what you addressed at the start, right? You shared a very good point about how toughness can always be translated into development, right? So for your development when you were in TPJC, is it TPJC or Temasek?
TPJC.
TPJC, right? What influenced you to have that approach? Because at that age, like for example, my generation, sometimes we might feel like we are trapped. We are like the victim in the situation. However, for you back then, was it your parents that influenced you to have this toughness that will equate to development? Or was it your friends? What was the trigger, the catalyst at that point of time?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about it that way. I suppose my parents were an influence to the extent that I was very, very fortunate to have a fairly blessed childhood. Even if financial circumstances were tough, my parents shielded us largely from that. They sort of instilled in us this idea that your financial circumstances will not define you. Your potential and your ability to work hard will. So that's always been instilled in us from day one. But in terms of, I suppose, answering the question of what sort of triggered that knowledge of resilience, quite frankly, the answer is, if you ask the Faizal in TPJC, he wouldn't tell you, he wouldn't have any answer. And the reason for that is I don't think it's necessarily something you sleep on and then one day you wake up in TPJC and you go, resilience can be built up by way of me going through hardship. Nobody really thinks like that, and nobody sort of does that shift. It's really after many years of walking the journey, when you sort of reflect back and think, what were points in which I developed the most? What were points in which were particularly good for me, for my development, that you then realize that there were certain parameters around it, part of which was resilience. So in a certain sense, my hope is that my own learning journey and my own reflections can be something that I share with you, because all of you understandably, like you rightly pointed out, will be in positions where these are not things that necessarily come to the forefront of your mind. And there's often this tendency to say, how would I know resilience is good for me? I've never gone through that journey like the speaker has, for example. And I don't have an easy answer to that, but I can say that based on my experiences, I do think it does toughen a person up. It does lead a person to have a certain attitude to working hard, to wanting to succeed, and that can only be a good thing.
We still have time for 2 more questions.
Hello, Mr. Faizal.
Yes.
My name is.
What's that? Yes. Hi.
My name is Ilhan. I'm currently a student in JC. I'm about to take my A-level soon, and I was interested in maybe doing law. But we all know that law school and the profession of law, it's a very long journey, very difficult journey. So for me and maybe others here who are considering a career in law, what are some traits that someone who would make a good lawyer would have? What is the profile of someone who you would encourage to do law? And also by extension, what is the profile of someone who you would discourage from doing law and say, okay, maybe this is not for you? And so maybe you can personalize your answer. What were some skills, unique skills, or maybe certain subjects you yourself were good in that made you decide that, okay, the law is for me and it's something I'll be good at? Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful question. Thanks, Ilhan. I'll start with the easier part about what not to go into law for. The first thing I would say is don't go into law for the money. And I know all of you might be sitting there going, yeah, easy for him to say, lah, right? And I understand that logic. But honestly, most of the people who I know who go into law for the money quit after a while. Because when you're at work on late Saturday night, late Sunday night, and you've not gone home for a very long period of time, money will be the least of your concerns. You go into law because you are passionate about wanting to be a voice for others, I think. And I'm putting it very simplistically, but I do think that that is at the heart of what the law is all about. You can do it in a multitude of ways, to be fair. You can do it as a prosecutor, as I did. You can do it as a lawyer outside, working with accused persons or working with clients with legal problems. All of that is fine. But you must ultimately want to make a difference to people. And if you're coming in thinking this will be easy, as you rightly pointed out, law isn't necessarily the easiest job in the world. And it is a real challenge at the outset when people have to deal with long hours, when people have to deal with the stresses, for example, of litigation. It does mean that you've got to ask yourself a real question of whether this is something you're passionate about or this is something you can grow to be passionate about. Don't do it because it sounds sexy. Believe me, again, if you are in the office at the night of Saturday night, Sunday night, it feels like the least sexiest thing in the world, right? It's not fun at all. But if you are there because you know doing that work makes a difference to someone, doing that work tangibly helps the system, tangibly helps the rule of law, then you will feel passionate about it, even if at the end of the day you will prefer to do that on a Friday morning than a Sunday evening, lah, right? All of us are built like that, but it will feel like it has a lot more meaning to you. So I would say make sure that it is aligned to your values. And the values in the law really is about wanting to make a difference to people, wanting to do justice, wanting to be someone's voice when they don't have a voice. Those are the kind of values to me that will have you have a really long career in the law, because even if the hours are long and even if the work is hard and those are given, you will find it to be deep in meaning. So you will accept that as part of a package which allows you to do very powerful work.
All right, can we have the last question?
Hello, good evening, Mr. Faizal.
Hi.
My question is related to one that was asked by my friend from that side earlier. So, like you mentioned, in the early 2000s and early 2010s, there was like a scourge of like money lending and like loan shark related crimes. And recently there has been a rise in the number of like drug related offenses, especially among minors. And like you mentioned, the courts like naturally tightened their legislation against such activities in that time. But especially in my generation, I think we already like are quite, we already do not like the current legislation towards drug-related offenses like capital punishment, and we're already questioning that. And with the further increase, I don't think it will be very easy for the courts to increase and tighten against such offenses. So how do you think that the courts will address this? And also, as a prosecutor previously, how did you handle like the human side of sentencing such offenses? Because I'm sure that you have maybe seen many a case where the person you're sentencing, you can't help but feel something for them.
Okay, so I'll deal with your question on two levels. Firstly, I think in terms of capital punishment, for example, the point I would make is that the law is the law. Now, one may dislike the law, and people have different views, understandably, on capital punishment, and that's understandable. But the courts are not there, and I come back to my point earlier, to determine what Singapore's drug policy is. So if Parliament, in its wisdom, decides that capital punishment should be imposed for certain types of offences, that is not for the courts to say this is bad policy. Because the question of whether there's a deterrent effect, the question of whether it's necessary for Singapore, is very much a value-laden discussion. It's a discussion for Singaporeans to have, and a discussion for Parliament after considering the views of Singaporeans as a body to decide what is the best approach for Singapore, and the courts administer the law in that specific context. So I suppose in that sense, the court must operate within the parameters that the law is developed in. Now, of course, if the law is illegal, and I'll take a very simple but very silly example. If the law says, for example, if your name is Mohammad Faizal, then it's capital punishment. Everybody else is not capital punishment. Then obviously that person should rightly point out that the law is discriminatory if the person is Mohammad Faizal, and the person should rightly challenge the law. And the courts will deal with that because that's a legal issue. The law is unfairly discriminating against this individual. But to the extent the person's complaint is, I don't like the law, I wish the law changes, the answer to that is the courts are not in the business of shaping policy. The courts are not in the business of saying laws are bad because I, the judge, prefer a different type of law. But the courts must administer the law as it stands. Then to your other question about how does a person deal with it. I can't speak to how other prosecutors have dealt with it, and I'm careful as well about saying too much about my work as a prosecutor because I'm no longer in the office. But I would say to some extent, as a lawyer, and it doesn't just apply to prosecutors, you often have to operate within the system you're in. So even if you were defense counsel, even if you were a lawyer who hates the laws, for example, you operate in the ecosystem. And you respect the law for what it is. It's still there, it still must be administered. As a defense counsel, you do your very best to ensure that your client's defense is put forth before the court. Even any technical defense you can raise, it's your duty to raise that to see whether you can get the client off on those technicalities. That's your duty as a defense counsel. As a prosecutor, it is our duty to put all of the relevant evidence before the court, and it's for the court to adjudicate guilt or otherwise. And on the assumption the court finds the person is guilty, again, the sentencing regime is defined by the parameters set by Parliament. So the court cannot say he's guilty, but I don't like the punishment, therefore I find a way around it. That would be inappropriate for a court to do. So in a certain sense, all of us accept that we're in the ecosystem. And yes, I think laws change with time, but it's for Singapore as a society to decide what framework they want, what framework they think is best for them. How that will come up, say, in the next 10, 15, 20 years is anyone's guess. But that's for society as a whole to decide. Yes.
All right, I think just to end on a light note, I would like to ask a question myself. Okay, what habit should we cultivate as young people to achieve success? Like what kind of habit? Do you wake up early, like 5 a.m. in the morning, or?
I wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, but to be fair, when you've got 3 kids, you do need to wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning. So it's not a habit I like, I wish I could sleep in, but I can't. But I think one habit I would say you need to cultivate in my mind is to always be curious. Always want to know more. Always ask the question of why. There's a natural tendency sometimes to go in, to say, for example, oh, I just need to study my textbook and I'll get A's and whatnot. And I think on some level there's some truth to that. But on another level, if you don't have a curious mind, you will end up ultimately, in my mind, not going very far in any profession. And the reason for that is a lot of the value proposition that you bring to any organization is asking the whys and thinking somewhat out of the box. Because at a particular stage, your academic abilities can only get you so far. But if you're not curious about the world, if you're not constantly upskilling on some level, if you're not constantly asking the whys and trying to find answer to the whys, then on some level, at some point of time, you will stagnate. And I wish for all of you the most curious minds you could have, because to me, that will set you on the path to success.
All right, that concludes the Q&A segment. Thank you so much, Mr. Faizal, for being so candid and answering the questions very honestly.